This is the Inner Chief Podcast, episode 323.
I argue that because we live in this type of hyperactive, highly visual, overstimulated world, people are rushing to judgment more than ever. They hear less than ever. There are more unheard populations than ever, and people are feeling unheard. And the reality is they are unheard because we can't hear them, because we're too busy, too distracted and not pausing long enough, or reflecting long enough, or second guessing enough to make better decisions.
G'day, this is the Inner Chief Podcast, episode 323. And our guest today is Nuala Walsh, founder and CEO of MindEquity and author of Tune In. We talk about the art of decision making like a ninja and learning to control your emotions and recognise your biases. I am your host, Greg Layton, founder of Chiefmaker and the Council of Chiefs. And I believe there is a great chief in all of us, and that through listening to the stories, strategies and techniques of great CEOs, each of you can find and leave your own legacy through your work. The Inner Chief Podcast is where you will learn how to think and make moves like a CEO. For over a decade, I've helped CEOs and senior executives around the world boldly lead change, inspire their people, and leave a legacy. So every 2 weeks, I'll bring a deep diving interview with one of these CEOs or another one of a mid to large organisation so you can find your own path to greatness as an executive. Righto, Chiefs. In this episode, I chat to Nuala Walsh. With over 30 years experience in FTSE-50 and Fortune 500 financial services firms, Nuala is the founder and CEO of MindEquity Consulting. She's also the founding director of the world's first global association of applied behavioural scientists. Prior to that, she was an award-winning chief marketing officer at Standard Life Aberdeen and had previous roles with Merrill Lynch, BlackRock and PA Consulting. Today, she sits on multiple advisory boards, including the British and Irish Lions Rugby Union, Basketball Ireland, the Innocence Project. She is the president of the Harvard Club of Ireland, is a deputy chair of the Football Association's Inclusion Board, and is a gender task force advisor at World Athletics. Listed among the top 100 most influential women in finance, she holds degrees in multiple disciplines, including a Master's in Behavioural Science from the London School of Economics, a Master's in Business Studies, and a BA in Philosophy. Nuala is a seasoned lecturer and keynote speaker with her work on behavioural science research, published and aired on the Harvard Business Review, TEDx, The Economist, The Telegraph, Forbes, BBC, and Fox Business. So Nuala is a heavy hitter and clearly knows how to make a quality decision in a busy world. Today, you're going to hear Nuala talk all about how choices shape your decision mindset and outcomes, the two systems of thinking, and how to optimize them for your decision-making scenarios, what you can do to control your emotions, like regret and rage, so you can de-risk bad decisions, recognizing your biases, of which there are over 200, and why not making a decision is still a decision. Nuala also has a fantastic book called Tune In, and we're going to talk all about that. Now, Chief, do you find yourself at work in one of those incredibly stressful moments where you've got someone on your team that either isn't performing or is behaving poorly, and you know deep down that it needs a difficult conversation? One of those ones that can keep you up at night. You know, if you get wrong, there's going to be HR issues, but you know, if you get right, it could actually be a little bit career defining, and it will make life so much better for so many people, but you just keep putting it off and off and off. Well, Chief, we've created the ultimate resource for you. It is called Difficult Conversations. Download, it's not hard, but what's in it is what's most powerful. The mindsets, the frameworks, and even some of the scripts, the words to use to make those conversations much more easy. Just go to chiefmaker.com straightforward/difficult, and you could download the full resource right there. Chief, before we get into today's episode, if you would like to nominate a CEO as guest of this show, drop us a line with your nominated guest on info@chiefmaker.com.au, and we'll check out and see if they are the kind of chief we want to have on our show. Chiefs, without any further ado, let's hear from our wonderful guest, Nuala Walsh, the founder and CEO of MindEquity. Righto, Chiefs. I'm here with the wonderful Nuala Walsh. Nuala, welcome to the Inner Chief podcast.
Thank you very much, Greg. Delighted to be here.
Nuala, this is a topic we have never discussed in 300 and something episodes. And when I was preparing for this, I thought to myself, of all the skills we need as chiefs and executives, surely, probably the most important is how to make a decision. And I thought to myself, I've never seen any formal training. I've never seen anyone really cover this end-to-end, in-depth. So I'm really, really happy you've written this book called Tune In, How to Make Smarter Decisions in a Noisy World. We'll get to that later. But I just want to say and frame that for everyone that's listening. This is critical stuff. This is such an important foundational skill. And Nuala is gonna make a big difference today in our lives. So Nuala, we love to start off with a bit of a history of our chiefs. We'd love to know where you come from. Can you tell a bit of a story that sums up your childhood and early life?
It'll be a very long story, Greg. It's been here quite a while. I'll just give you some context.
Yeah.
As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm Irish. So grew up in Dublin. I'm one of 5 children, 5 girls, would you believe?
Okay.
So that made for a very interesting background. I'm the middle child, so I suffer acute middle child syndrome, which means my voice must always be heard because it's never heard.
That's great.
Yeah. So the fantastic, I guess, I won't say, well, no one's childhood is fantastic, as it were, but I've got a fantastic grounding, I think, in terms of I had very close involvement with my grandparents, I think, which played a huge role.
Yeah.
They actually feature in the book occasionally. And I was raised by my mother, which again made it for a household of 6 women, which was interesting. And as we all know, you don't need to be a professional psychologist to know that whatever happens in your childhood shapes your life, shapes your attitude, and your path. So many different things. I mean, fast forward, I think what's interesting is that now it's actually ironically come full circle. So all of the stuff that I was interested in growing up, or people that I saw, topics that were of professional interest, have now come full circle, like my interest in psychology, for example. So as a teenager, I used to read an awful lot of psychology books, and then I went and I studied philosophy, and then I did forensic psychology. Fast forward 30 years, I did an MSc in behavioural science at the London School of Economics. Fast forward 5 more years, and I've just written my first book on decision making, but in a business context. And ironically, also there's quite a smattering of criminal side of life. I feature quite a few serial killers, astronauts, pilots, professionals, therapists, professors, you name it. So it's actually a blend. All the stories are a blend of the encounters and the professional journey that I have had, with a little bit of a smattering. I decided I better put in some anecdotes from my family if I wanted them to read it. So I put a few in, not too many, but I put a few in there as well. And I also actually wanted to reflect in many ways the things that mattered most. So if there was a story mattered or I found hugely fascinating, that I made sure that got featured. So I guess when you go through it and when you see it in my writing, because I also write for a number of different publications now, Forbes and Ancient Psychology Today, I reflect what I'm doing now, which is also sitting on a number of boards. So you can see it all sort of merges together. So I have a significant sport background, not because I'm an athlete, I hasten to add, but because in my corporate life of 30 years in financial services, when I was doing that for about 20 of those years, we sponsored major events in rugby, tennis, golf, and now I sit in boards in athletics, in football, and basketball. So it's just quite interesting how everything you do comes full circle, and maybe that's a theme we'll get to as we move forward.
You know, as I listen to the thing that resonates or that sort of comes through is that decision making is in every part of life. It's in every industry. It's everything from astronauts on the moon to serial killers to elite sport. It's in the boardroom. It's on day one for a candidate. It's in a recruitment interview. It's at home with a family. And we're constantly making decisions. Let's get into that in a minute. I just want a couple more questions to start us off. What was your first ever job?
Waitressing in a local bar, stroke lounge.
Yep, fantastic. And your first ever car?
My first ever car was a Honda Civic, and it was red, and it matched my nails and it matched my lipstick, believe it or not.
Fantastic.
Something that I think it was intentional at the time. It was my very first, just as I left college and went for my first job.
Do you think when Honda was sitting there with their marketing team about to go to market, do you think they thought, hey, listen, when we pick the colour schemes, we better make sure it matches the nail polish colours available in Ireland?
I think they might, Greg. They're a pretty forward-thinking organisation. They knew their audience. I think they're very tuned into their audience. So I think they might. And if they have got the perfect shade, well, I think they probably expanded their offering to the market.
Fantastic.
Good point.
Okay, let's get into decision making. In your book, there is a quote from Stephen Covey, and it says, "I'm not a product of my circumstances. I'm a product of my decisions." Can you just talk a little bit about what that means for you and what you've seen that demonstrates that?
Yeah, I like the quote. I like the quote because most people tend to see that they are a product of their background. And you just asked about mine. And in many respects, of course, we are. We are a product of everything we've learned, everybody we've met, company we keep, the environment we work in, etc. So people know that and get that pretty easily. But on the other hand, people that then also like to think it, well, it's I'm not a product of my circumstances. I'm actually it's all about the decisions. Or sorry, people don't think about that enough. And that's why I liked the quote, because people have choice. And this is, I guess, the argument, free will and determinism. Do you make choices independently or not? And I'll give you maybe just an example. When I left college, my first job was with PA Consulting. And I was on assignment in Africa for the World Bank. And at the time, I was doing forensic psychology. And one of the papers that I had to write while I was over there was about this free will and determinism. Do we have choice? Does the environment shape us, or do we shape the environment? And before I went, I had a view that, in actual fact, if you're a strong personality and you know where you're going and you're goal-oriented, you can do anything. But there were lots of examples in life, and we see that of, how strong personalities do things. And that was sort of going to be my argument of the paper. But when I had spent a couple of weeks in Africa, as part of my first job, I actually realized that I was wrong. That no matter how bright you are, how strong-willed you are, how much self-belief you have, or how ambitious you are, that in many cases, sometimes your circumstances can overwhelm you. So it's not always about just being a strong personality. It is sometimes about your decisions, etc. as well. So I sort of changed my mind on that tack, and I understood the importance of circumstances as well. So it all goes, I guess, to the point that you can make choices, but you must make them in a context-specific, situation-specific environment as well. And what I try to do in the book is, generally, is to understand that we do have a choice. Life isn't determined. You might be working for a company that you hate, or in a relationship that you're unhappy in, but at the end of the day, we all have choice. And too often, people think, well, I'm in this company and I'm stuck, or, well, I only got X in my degree I won't get another job anywhere else, or, oh, I'll never find somebody else. That sort of thinking is part of your circumstances. You feel trapped in those circumstances. And I argue that maybe you can't choose to change your circumstances like some of the people that I did meet in Africa and other places, but you can change your attitude to wherever you are as well. And I think that can be the difference between making good decisions and bad decisions. Decisions that aren't in your, bad as in not in your best long-term interests. So there is something in there, this whole concept of having choice, being a good architect of your own decisions, empowering yourself to be a decision ninja, choosing the voices that you listen to, choosing the voices that you don't, and tuning out, bullies or posters or braggers or people who make you feel bad, tuning out experts or idols whom, yes, you admire, but B, can completely derail you if you don't reconsider what they've said and just take what people say at face value. And that's part of the, I guess, tuning out philosophy, is that we take things at face value. We encode any story that you hear. We don't decode what people say. We don't go to the second point of interpretation. And as a result, sometimes we just ignore subtext, feedback, advice, the right instruction, because we're relying on what we see, and we live in a fast-paced, attention-deprived world. So there's a huge amount in there to unpack. But really, what I'm trying to say is that you're a product of your decision mindset. Even though, of course, there are circumstances that stop you doing certain things, but you do control what's in your mind, and you do control your attitude to whatever decision scenario you're facing.
That's a really important distinction, and I think it's a good build on what Kobe said, although I think he's probably talking about people who are in pretty good circumstances most of the time. And having spent a lot of time in Africa working over there, I would absolutely back you up on that some people are just in a scenario where they can be brilliant decision makers, but they just are in such a horrendously difficult position. It would be hard for them to make too much of a dent without someone giving them a hand.
Right, and that's right, and the role of luck.
You spoke there quite, like you jumped down a couple of rabbit holes there that I really want to sort of unpack. Part of it is this question, like there's obviously a science behind decision making, the way the brain operates, where we bring in information like you're talking about, well, a story comes in, or we apply an extra amount of credit to that story because it's an influencer, or from a newspaper that we read every day or something like that. There's a science behind this. Can you give us a little bit of an outline of the science and process behind actually how do we make decisions? Or is it actually that it's not one way, that everyone is so different and that's the problem?
No, there absolutely is a science, and I'm glad you've asked, because it actually plays to something you mentioned earlier, which is your first question, which is why people don't even think about this. Because it's big, and I mean, to be honest, this whole field of decision making, there is a science. It is a field called decision science, and it encompasses a number of different disciplines, from neuroscience, behavioural science, psychology, and there's a very strong influence on social science and sociology, just as you mentioned there, about influencers. But the problem is that because it's not taught academically, because it's not on the curriculum, and because it's not taught in boardrooms either, Greg, you can be forgiven for thinking it's not a science, and it's not a hard science, because, as you know, people love what's logical. We love the spreadsheets, we love the charts, we love the graphs, we love the data. But we don't think, well, actually, we love the psychological just as much as the logical. So people like what they can explain. We are, pattern-seeking people and explanation hunting machines, if you like, and we want to make sense of things, and therefore we don't appreciate enough that there are so many different biases that the average person is susceptible to. And look, even the first one, I mean, we've all heard of biases, but maybe we don't realize that there are 200 of them. You mentioned earlier we make a lot of decisions. Well, we make 35,000 a day, and 95% of those are actually made unconsciously. And there's a fantastic science that does explain this in very, very simple terms. And it's by a Nobel Prize winner, Daniel Kahneman. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Thinking Fast.
Exactly. And it's a fantastic book. It's very hard to read. I'm not sure I would quite say read it at your leisure, but you would be reading it at your leisure because it's jam-packed with fantastic explanations and theory. But anyway, he advocates something that's called System 1 and System 2. And basically, he suggests that you either make your decision in System 1 or System 2. System 1 is that automatic, intuitive, fast-paced mode of thinking. And you kind of use that for a routine decision. You drive, you wash your teeth, you make tea, you don't really think. And then System 2, which is slower, deliberate, and analytical. Obviously, that's something that you would use for a more complex decision, or an investment that you might be making, or, or a political decision or whatever. And everybody, no matter who they are, no matter what age they are, no matter how successful they are, they tend to go to System 1 or System 2. Problem is that we use System 1, that fast, intuitive decision-making, on areas where we should be using System 2. So let's say you're hiring somebody. You judge a book by its cover, you think, oh, they look like me, hire them. Really, no, we're not allowed to do that, but you do it anyway. And you spend 90% of the time justifying why that person is, intellectually correct, or intellectually a good fit, and has the right caliber and the right potential and all these other things. But when you say, and then so obviously the conclusion will be, well, you must use System 2 more. However, with System 2, but there's no simple answer here, is that you are equally prone to biases. But they're different biases. So you might be prone to the illusion of invulnerability, but then you think nothing can go wrong, or you might have, certainty bias, or you might neglect probability, or you might keep escalating your commitment, like in that hiring example, you just keep going and going, or you use confirmation bias to constantly confirm the original decision. So within that, you have a better chance of making a good decision if you do use System 2 and you slow down and don't use System 1 when it matters. But we don't do that. And we don't do that because, exactly as your first question was, because of the context and the circumstances that we live in. And today, as you well know, we live in a very fast-paced, attention-deprived, distracting, overloaded world. And it's very difficult to cope. It really is. And it's very difficult to filter voices, not just in your head, but voices around you and the sources of information and misinformation. And I think that's one of the major challenges of the book. And I argue that because we live in this type of hyperactive, highly visual, overstimulated world, people are rushing to judgment more than ever. They hear less than ever. There are more unheard populations than ever, and people are feeling unheard. And the reality is they are unheard because we can't hear them, because we're too busy, too distracted, and not pausing long enough, or reflecting long enough, or second guessing enough to make better decisions. And I don't even need to tell you about the consequences. And you only need to read the papers. We look at misconduct, miscarriages of justice, malpractice, politicians' errors. It's a long list, and we could be here a long time talking about that. But it is something worth considering.
Now, Chief, do you want to take your game to a new level, or that of your people? Our mini MBA in leading high performance teams now has the highest NPS of any mini MBA style program in Australia at 91. Why? Because when you do the program, you get immediate and tangible performance improvement. You get dedicated time working on the business as opposed to away from it. We have a practical, real-world approach that we teach frameworks that you implement in your business as we go, and then you share and learn with your peers and with me as your coach. So the cost benefit is immediate, right? The weekly coaching sessions are live, and you get a chance to ask questions direct to me and of your peers. And the time management is completely achievable because you're only spending a couple of hours a week on this at max, and those 2 hours are actually working on the business. So if you want to add something that really changes your game, that helps you become a real master of transformation and change, and to inspire your people and love your job, check out chiefmakeup.com/mini MBA. I'm reminded of that. I think it was Tony Robbins. He might not have been the first guy to say it, but it was people buy on emotion and justify with logic.
That is completely correct. They do.
Yeah. Yeah, just remind me that way you spoke there. But what I quite liked about that work of Kahneman on System 1 and System 2, and the thing that blows your mind away is that 35,000 decisions in a day, let's say 33,000 are unconscious, and let's say that 32,000 of those should be System 1, right? But there's 500 or 1,000 need to be in System 2, and you're running a really poor, potentially completely automatic, simple, out of control process on. That's having a pretty strong influence on you. You just described something very well that's going on, is this overwhelm of information and social media and this absolute, like the intensity of life these days really puts us all in a bit of a state of hyper awareness and slightly anxious and slightly on edge, and never really in that state of calm, coming from a place of wisdom. And that's emotional state difference. Outside of process, what role does emotional state play? Like in your experience, what have you seen people get this, make almost with the right process, but because their emotion was wrong, the whole thing just fell over?
You know, the topic of emotion is enormous, Greg, absolutely enormous. And I'd actually have a chapter on emotion. But I struggled with the chapter because written on one emotion alone.
Yep.
Take envy or regret, even if it's started, or pride or shame. Fantastic. It's an enormous topic. And what I try to focus on here is the positive and negative. So obviously we know it works both ways. So the roller coaster reasoning that we undergo is phenomenal. You do have these fleeting hot and cold states. I mean, a visible example was at the Oscars, where Will Smith punched Chris Rock for this ill-timed joke, and it must have been the biggest night of his career. But he ruined it for himself and the family and the entire cast of the King Richard. So respond emotionally in System 1 when they like or dislike what they hear. And I think if this illogic voice just drums in our head, and in the moment, the judgment just gets completely overwritten. But the problem is that our most important decisions are made through this affective lens. And the emotions, of course, have potent, they're predictable and they're hard. But now sometimes they're beneficial, we know. But, we're talking about how it derails us. And I think it's something you can have. There are so many different examples of rage. Rage is one that I focus on quite a lot, because I think it's one that's maybe underestimated. But regret is huge. Regret, there's so much, and it's a good lens to make decisions. I actually do apply what I call the regret test when I can't decide for something. So if I was, and there was something, any decision, I'm thinking, well, which would I regret more, doing the thing or not doing it? And you really have to think about that. And which can you live with? Because I might regret it either way. Which regret can I live with most? And for me, that's a really simple one to do it. But Daniel Pink, I don't know if you've read any of his work, but
I have.
He got the book on regret. And he likes to look at, and there was an Australian nurse actually who recorded all the regrets of dying patients. I don't know if you know this study.
And I've seen that. Yeah.
Yeah, and she didn't exactly hear many references to Ferragamo handbags or Honda cars or Facebook followers. The most recited regret was that people wish they had the courage to live a life true to themselves, not a life that other people expected. And I think that was just phenomenal. Think about that. True to yourself, yes, we would say that, but a life that other people expect, I think we do that, Greg. I think that we spend an awful lot of our time for all these succession management reasons, all of these identity seeking reasons. And I'm not immune to it myself. We all do it.
Yeah.
But the thing is to catch yourself doing it. And when you're doing it, ask yourself, why am I doing this? And it's what caused it? Who am I really trying to impress? And I do this myself. I think, who am I really trying to impress with this? Who really care what they think? Sometimes I don't. And I'm thinking, well, why am I putting myself through X? I don't really care what Y thinks about this. In the beginning, you think they do, and that's what I mean about tuning into these proper voices. Go a stage further when you're not sure about something or something doesn't sit well with you. Let's go that stage further and ask, why am I doing this? whose agenda am I playing to, mine or theirs, or it could be your companies, be your anyone, it could be an audience, it could be absolutely anybody. And I think when you calibrate your options, it's really useful, and particularly for ethical dilemmas. So it has what they call an instant pooling effect, which I think can be really, really powerful for people.
Sorry, can you explain that in a bit more detail?
Yeah. So if you calibrate your decisions before they happen. So so before you conclude, basically if you pause, reflect on whatever it is you're doing, ask yourself a couple of these questions. And there are a number that you can ask, and I give a lot of samples and tips and techniques that people can use in any sort of power-based scenario or risk-based scenario or ethical-based scenario, or even when they're just under pressure or in crisis or in uncertainty. There are a number of questions that you can ask. But if you apply this regret test, it instantly pulls your ardor. So you're not in a hot state, as it were. So because what happens is, Greg, suddenly you've gone to the worst case scenario. So if you're unsure and if you're deciding between options and you think, what's the worst thing that can happen here?
Yep.
Whatever active. And then you think, well, how likely? So you apply the probability test then. How probable or how likely is this to happen? In most cases, the worst case scenario is kind of unlikely. Really, the worst one. The worst one is what you fear. So if you then say to yourself, well, okay, well, that's what the worst thing that can happen, and you're writing it down or you're thinking about it, and then you ask yourself, well, what can I do about that? So if this terrible, terrible worst case scenario happens, what can I or my team or my company do about it? And if you have a solution, you might want the solution, but you have a solution. So you have a solution to this worst case scenario. You have shrunk the consequentiality of your decisions. And I talk about this in my TED talk on indecision. And it's really powerful because you've suddenly taken the emotion out of it. You have reduced the consequentiality. You're no longer as afraid of it. And that's why you don't make a decision, because you're sitting in some state of paralysis and fear. And that's why you procrastinate. So I think when you do this and you use emotion, so you use the regret test to conquer emotion, fear, or envy, or any of these other things, because envy can equally spark very negative, decisions that sabotage you and other people. It can be a silent kill in many ways. So it's using emotion to manage emotion. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll share with you a little technique that I've used over the years that help on the risk thing. I'd love your feedback on it. I've always thought about risk as it's an equation. It's risk and return. Right? Risk does not operate in isolation of anything. And what you've just described there is the beautiful test that goes, hey, what's the risk? What's the likelihood? And how do I either reduce the likelihood or the actual thing happening? But the other side is, hey, what's the return? What am I actually trying to get done here? And what's the likelihood of us being successful? So how can I increase the size of the outcome of what I want? Can I add more things to it to make it even more awesome? And how can I increase the likelihood of that? And so the equation reduces the downside and increases the upside. And I found over the years that sort of has got me out of some real funks where I'm so focused on what could go wrong that I am no longer outcome focused on what could go right.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting. So you've swung the pendulum to the wrong side rather than maintaining a happy state of equilibrium, as it were. I think you're absolutely right. But again, I would probably point you, so you're not wrong insofar as you can't go so far down the negative spiral that you become indecisive and can't make a decision.
Yeah.
But equally, if you swing too far right to the optimistic bias, naive optimism, overconfidence, what you're doing is you're underweighting the risk. So it is a happy state. It is a balance there. And that's why very simply people say, consult others for decisions. I mean, quite frankly, otherwise you, and the great thing is, Greg, is that you have recognized that you're going too far on one side. And then when the decision is actually made, I think you touched on something there about, you mentioned the word outcome, which triggered in my mind, we decide whether a decision is a good decision based on the outcome. So if you drive through a red light and no one gets hurt, well, was that a good decision or not? Well, Was it or wasn't it? You think it's a great decision because you were late for your meeting, you got there on time, and hey, no one got hurt.
Yeah.
You probably didn't see that. You probably didn't see that secret camera. Anyway,
It was a good decision
find it
for
in the
4 weeks
post, by the
until the
way.
bill turned up. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. But we do this all the time, Greg.
Yeah.
And take an example that has been talked about recently is Alexei Navalny, right? The Russian dissident.
Oh yes, sorry,
made a
yes.
decision.
Yeah.
Made a decision to back to Russia. Okay, and he was incarcerated in a penal colony and mysteriously, suddenly reached an unfortunate demise. Okay, so question, when people were looking at that case, and you can apply this to any case really, when people were looking at that, was such a good decision or was that a bad decision for him to return, knowing that there was a likelihood that he would be incarcerated, but also there was a probability that, well, the people would all rally behind him and Putin would be overthrown and he would lead the people in the next regime. So in his mind, was a possibility, the latter would happen, and he would help overthrow the regime. So who decides whether that? So my question, it's an open question, really. Who decides whether that was a good decision? His family, Well, they will. Well, I don't know what they will decide, but they will look at that and they will either decide it was a good or a bad decision. But no matter what, they will justify it. We will all justify our decisions, and there are a number of different moral mechanisms, if you like, mechanisms that people use to justify their decisions, and often it is done to justify immoral decisions. So people and they're called the principles of moral disengagement, and there are 7 or 8 of them, and they're like euphemisms or lots of different ones. I won't go into them all now because it's a fascinating area to look up and read up on. But there are 8 of these that you can use, and you use it to justify it. So that's in a negative scenario. People choose to reframe it. So I don't know, maybe people would frame that quite positively. Hero who made his mark, tried to do things. There's another school of thought that will interpret it completely differently. And that's exactly the point of this book, which is you judge decisions based on their outcome. Usually the salesperson has great sales in a company. Well, the company, the leaders are normally going to give them champagne rather than go, well, now how exactly did you do that? And that's what happened. That's exactly what happened with Jerome Corvail in SocGen. I don't know if you remember the road trader in the French company, Société Générale, and there was a rogue trader, and that's exactly what they did. They gave him champagne and thought, how come this junior is suddenly producing these fantastic results? Care because they were being rewarded and getting great bonuses. So rather than probing, even though they had been warned by compliance that something was astray and things weren't quite right, they basically ignored it and tuned out. So the leaders tuned out because it didn't suit them to hear there might be something wrong and not to listen to those alarm bells. And again, SocGen lost billions on back of that, and reputation damage. The government was involved, and it just, started this cascade of error and reputation recovery that eventually took years to overcome in that particular company. But the story is replicated everywhere. There are lots of Jerome's in business, and Jerome's managers. It's not even Jerome, it's Jerome's managers. It's the managers who are absolutely guilty and complicit by being bystanders in that particular situation. So I think you raise an excellent point.
Yeah, this is such a big topic. Oh, we could go a million ways. I'm just thinking back to your TEDx talk, which everybody needs to listen to, because you actually talk about some things we haven't covered at all, and we won't have time to. But one was you spoke about reframing, the importance of that, and one that made me giggle was when you spoke about the person that wakes up after sending a drunken text and goes, well, I'll just have to reframe that as a learning experience. That's another example of how these decisions play out, right?
Well, the hypothetical example, of course, Greg, of course.
So look, one of the terms you use is become a decision ninja. So there's a bunch of other models and frameworks in the book, but I would like to just touch on this a bit, because I think we've painted a pretty good picture here. Like you've shown us that decisions are far and wide. There is all sorts of myopic views and bias-driven views, And when we get in the corporate world, we can get a real energy and a line of almost. I remember there was something happened in Victoria during these huge lockdowns where they employed an external security workforce, and there's a big review into it, and I won't go into it, and I don't want to get partisan or anything. But what they came out and they said was, no individual made the decision. It was just something that started to happen and the decision was made, but no single person made it. And so because no single person made it, no one was culpable for the thing that happened. So we're all faced with challenges like this. Can you talk through, you've got a little model called SONIC decisions, which stands for slow down, organize your attention, navigate novel perspectives, interrupt mindsets, and calibrate situation, changes and strategies. Could you give us a couple of minutes lesson on what that means?
Well, firstly, the decision ninja, it was a way to describe the end state. So, what you want to be, if you want to be a good decision maker. So, a decision ninja is someone who gets it more right than wrong, quite something. And that involves being intentional, being noticing what's said and what's not said, and exactly how a journalist will interrogate their sources, or an investigator will, crack their case, and negotiators, might win a deal. And the strategies that I've laid out, those SONIC strategies, there aren't quite a lot of them. But what you have to do first is analyze what are the biases that you're exposed to. So unless you appreciate first what are the traps that you're falling into, and I think I pointed out 10 that power, ego, risk, memory, emotion, etc. So when you fall into those traps, you need to know which one you're talking about. Because there are 200 biases, it's very easy just to say, well, if you do X and you do Y, you will make a great decision. It's just not that simple, because you need to diagnose what bias you're exposed to first. Now, that's not as hard as it sounds, because if you know that you are, exactly as you were saying, if you're prone to, you might, and you probably know if you are, if you're not, or if you're desperate to hold on to power or afraid of losing it, well, you just go to the power-related biases, have a look and say, okay, well, that's what I would do in that scenario for power-related issues. So there is an easy way to sort of apply this thinking. I mean, I've suggested that people introduce decision friction. And decision friction, in the normal online world, if you want to cancel a subscription and it's hard, they call that friction, friction for the customer, and it's really negative, and who wants it? But apply decision friction. It's like the system 2 that we were talking about earlier. You deliberately interrupt your thought before forming a judgment, and it's simply adopting a series of prompts or new rules or nudges or questions, like the ones that we were talking about earlier. Do that. You interrupt your mode of thinking when you slow down. So you can't just slow down yourself if you're in a hot state and you're angry and annoyed at somebody. But if you decide in the beginning, if you decide up front that you want to be a better decision maker, and there's no point even, it's like saying I want to lose weight. Well, unless you've actually decided you want to lose weight, you're not going to. You must commit to being a better decision maker, particularly in a high stakes situation. And that is a mindset change, just as easy as if you're going to try and get fit. So it becomes a habit. You apply these questions, you look through all of these different options that people can have, and it's like a speed bump for your mind. And the good news, Greg, is that you only need to do this temporarily to filter these negative voices or adverse voices during a hot state. And if politicians didn't, if leaders, if CEOs did this, people who really hold a lot of power, it's one thing to do it for yourself. It's another thing to do it in an organization. But from a societal level, like you're saying, that the person said, well, nobody made the decision. Well, you all made the decision, because they all made it because they were all complicit. What you had there was a bunch of bystanders, but they were all complicit, and they were all guilty of that, obviously. But when you're looking at scale at a social level, things become either good or bad. I mean, you can take it positively and say that the Me Too movement was, fantastic. The Bob Geldof Band-Aid or Live Aid, was very successful. It raised a huge amount of money for Africa back in the 80s. So, and during COVID, Lady Gaga did a similar, big charity event and got a lot of people behind it. So these Black Lives Matter, any of these momentum-based movements, happen at scale, and you can use crowd and emotion for good, so that good decision and good decision outcomes, result on the back of it.
I'd just like to talk about something that comes up a lot in my work, and I'd love to know how to approach it in some ways. Well, one thing that happens a lot, because I go away with a lot of leadership teams, and we work on what they've done in the last 12 months and what's coming, right? So we do a lot of reviews of their performance. But what I can see a lot of leaders and leadership teams and boards do is they put off making a decision, right? And so they say, well, we haven't made a decision about this yet. My challenge to that is, well, no decision is actually a decision. It's a decision to not make this decision, a decision to not proceed. And a lot of the time, there's a whole series of consequences that flow through the organization they're involved with because they didn't make a decision. But then, because they didn't make a decision, they don't feel like there's any ownership of the consequences. So there's a thing there which is no decision, or not making a decision is actually a decision. How do we become more aware of that is sort of part one. And part two is, how do you work with your teammates on reviewing the quality of your decisions?
Decision is a decision is absolutely right. And people suffer a lot when they're making a decision, they can't make the decision. And it's not a good state to be when you're struggling, you actually just can't decide, because you're so torn with the consequences. You have disproportionately magnified consequences in your mind of X or Y. We do that. So, and that is what's keeping you trapped in that zone of indecision. So how do you make people more aware of it? I think they know. I think they know that no decision is a decision. So even just saying it, people even say that in companies, because in companies, most of the time, you're rewarded for big decisions, not to admit that they can't make a decision. So we're examples of people who just say, well, let's defer that, or let's put that off. It's very understandable why they do that, because in many cases, I think that there was a Harvard study that showed that, CEOs are 12 times more likely to get the top job, or individuals are more likely to become a CEO, rather, if they make quick, fast decisions. So fast decision in that case is rewarded rather than an accurate decision or a good decision. So it's understandable that people put things off, particularly now in this crazy loaded world that we live in. So I think it's obvious. I think it will be obvious to people, Greg, when that's happening, and calling it out like you just out there, I think would be a very good way to do that, so that you bring it out there and make it comfortable for people to say, it's okay not to be able to make a decision. We all have that, but nobody admits it. And certainly in companies, I mean, if you're not in a position of power, or if you are in a position of power, it's much harder to admit it than if you're not. And then, how would you evaluate a decision? Well, I think it goes back to that outcome question. How do you evaluate whether you went on, whether you do anything? You go on a holiday, you pick the wrong destination. Well, my goodness, you're going to justify that, unless it's a real disaster. Even if it's not great, you'll justify it while you're there. I find this really fascinating. You justify it as much as you can while you're there, because you don't want to ruin the holiday. But the day you come home, you go, well, I wouldn't go back there again. Or I'm not sure I would recommend, but for every day and every minute you're there having your cocktail and in the cloud, sun's gone. You justify it and you say, well, at least we're having a break, or at least we're doing this, that, and the other. That happens no matter whether you're a president or a professor or a parent, making a decision. We all do that. And I think you decide the quality, you decide the outcome, you decide. Now, I should correct myself in one respect. Today, in a social media environment, your Twitter followers decide about some of your decisions and some of your misjudgments. And oh my goodness, you will be cancelled before you will be complimented on anything. That's true. It's a dangerous world, dangerous from that perspective.
Righto, Chiefs. More from Nuala in a minute. Now, recently I interviewed Jeremy Hastings, founder and managing director of Hutley. We spoke about being fired from his own company and how, after working deeply on his inner chief, he successfully returned to Hutley and is transforming the real estate industry with a range of products, including their latest one, Bondable. Here's what Jeremy had to say about getting the dreaded tap on the shoulder from the board.
Yeah, it was brutal. Very, very difficult period of my life. So I look back and I think there was two elements. One, I hired a whole lot of people who didn't have technology experience, and I hired them because I knew them and from my mining days and through my personal networks. And in hindsight, what I actually did was I set them up for failure and I set the business up to have a really tough time. And then you couple that with, your own learning journey. You don't know. So, I would very much back then, as a first-time founder, make a whole lot of data.
You can listen to that remarkable chat with Jeremy. Just go to chiefmaker.com/322. Righto, Chief, let's get back to the remarkable Nuala Walsh. This has just been fascinating, Nuala, and I can't thank you enough for your time. I've just got a couple of questions to finish. If you could form the ultimate performance support team, right? So you get to pick 3 or 4 people who surround you to make you, in this case, probably the best decision maker in the world. Doctors, trainers, professors, CEOs, athletes, coaches. Who would you pick and why? Top 3.
Well, that is a hard question.
It's a hard one.
I'm tempted to say my close friend for one of them, but I might leave her out for now. I would say I would pick my first one would be Muhammad Ali. And I would pick him for his drive and his motivation and his self-belief. You just can't help but look at that man and smile. So I think I would bring her. I think the second one, I actually might bring Elon Musk. Because I know he's a controversial figure, but I would bring him anyway, for his innovation and diversity of thought. So yeah, I think I would have him on the team, and I'm tempted to say a Mother Teresa type, who inject some kind of kindness into this alpha team that I've put
it's
together.
A bit of an alpha team.
So a Mother Teresa type. I'm not sure who. I'm sure she's not around anymore, so we can't have her.
From any time in history is fine. That's fine. You can have Mother Teresa.
Mother Teresa then, because she was such a kind person. And that's notwithstanding anyone else. But otherwise, when you ask that question, do you automatically go to well-known figures and leaders in history, or do you go to your inner circle? And I think it's an interesting one, because if I asked you, Greg, who are the 3 people you go to for advice? You would pick 3 people who look like you and 3 people who like you. And that, of course, is another trap, because you're in that zone of we all go to what's familiar and similar rather than looking for difference. But anyway. And as I look at these people now I'm thinking, how many of these look like me or are similar to me? Well, I didn't do too badly.
Yeah, you'd probably do better than I would have. Nuala, what are you most grateful for in life?
Well, that's probably the easiest question, Greg, that you've asked me all session. That is my husband of nearly 40 years. So wow. I think everybody is very lucky if they have somebody. So I think he'll be blushing now, but I'm going to say my husband.
Well done. That is a great achievement, and wow, what a decision, right? 40 years, that's a good one. Yeah.
That was the best decision I ever made.
What is the best advice a mentor has ever given you?
Well, that is a hard one. I think it would probably come from a coach that I had in the last phase of my last role. And he was an excellent coach. He specialized in corporate trauma, of all things. Trauma counselor, not that I was in trauma, but that was his expertise. It was for organizations in trauma. But his advice was, I was in a company where I was hugely regarded for my skills and for my contribution. From a personality fit with them, what 2 people that I worked with, and I just mean the one or two, I probably wasn't a great fit for them personality-wise. And they liked him, but I'm sure they would have made me their first port of call if they were in a pub, for example. And I think, for me, Greg, that has always been my acid test in a company. We all think our leader likes us, or that certain people, whose approval you need to climb the ladder. But who do they go to? Who do they gravitate towards when in a social setting? And I've watched that for years. So to answer your question, the advice was from this excellent coach was that if you don't fit a company, leave, because you're trying to adjust your personality, even though you're very successful and you've got a great seat at the table, but personality fit they don't gel with you particularly, and it's hidden. So it's personality-wise, goes back to that point that people like people who are like themselves. And if you are an introvert and someone else is an extrovert, you know what? They might like you temporarily. Not going to marry you, and they're not going to sit in a pub with you because it's too draining for them. It's too cognitively and emotionally draining for them to match that for too long. I do generalize, but that is my experience. So the advice from this coach was, don't shoehorn yourself in, adapt yourself all the time. Just think about whether this is the right company for you. I don't think they quite said leave, but they basically said, reconsider your fit. Why are you trying to fit into somewhere where, if it's working, great, but if it gets to a point where it doesn't work, then reconsider that. I should take their advice, by the way, but I should have.
Yep.
That's why it was the best advice, but I just didn't take it at the time.
Okay, two more questions. If you could lead any company in the world, be the CEO or the board chair, what organization would it be?
Well, I'm going to say, Greg, that where I am in life, I wouldn't choose to lead any company. Am I allowed to say that?
You can. Yeah.
So I wouldn't, but in a previous life, today I wouldn't choose to lead any major company because I'm very happy doing what I'm doing. I would have chosen to have led a prison, actually. And maybe that does play to my forensic psychology, because the treatment of people in prison, and don't get me wrong, rehabilitation I get, but I think the treatment of people, prisoners in prison, is horrendous in the most, whether it's privately owned or whether they're state prisons, is really below human rights level. There is exceptional abuse. There's abuse everywhere. But in prisons, it's incredibly bad. I say that out loud. Maybe I have chosen somewhere. Take my coach's advice and years later and go find myself a prison to help influence. It's because probably I work with the Innocence Project, which is focused on wrongful conviction. So it's something that I do feel that not only does somebody get into prison wrongly, and some people do, but actually when they're in there, it's really, really bad in many cases. So I think I would, in a free world, I would like to try and help people, I guess, the prison, whether they're guilty or not. I would like to create a better environment for people to spend their time.
To actually rehabilitate. Okay, a final message of wisdom and hope for the next generation of chiefs.
Oh my goodness. Well, there can only be one, Greg, really, given that I'm talking about my book, can't there? And that would be to tune in to the voices that really matter when it matters, so that you stand out and not lose out.
Perfect. Well delivered. That is a magical way to finish. Nuala, can't thank you enough for your time and your wisdom. This is a huge topic. People just need to buy your book and read it. I've had I haven't read the whole thing just yet, but I've seen a very good whack of it. And I think people need to really learn about this. And like, people can't really see all of my shelves here, but quite a lot of the people you mentioned, I've been studying a lot of this for years, not to your depth, but this is so important. So thank you for everything you do.
Well, thank you so much, Greg. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you for taking the time.
Righto, Chief. That sums it up for this week. And the fantastic Nuala Walsh. Nuala has just had so much experience over an outstanding career. She is trusted far and wide for her counsel and her expertise. and I really hope you enjoy her book as well. Do not forget to check that out. Now, all the links to the book and her website and all her socials can be found at chiefmaker.com/323.
Now, Chief, if you're yet to rate the episode and subscribe, I hope you'll do so soon. It helps others see the magnificent value that the chiefs and gurus on the show bring to their life and career. So make sure you hit subscribe on your podcast app now, give it a 5-star rating if you think it's worthy, and leave a short review about your favourite episode.
Righto, Chief. As always, remember to stay happy.